Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival from Diggy Palace, the front lawns, protected by Dettol. Today's session is supported by media partner Business Standard. It's our pleasure to present Asia and Australia, Mapping Alternative Realities. Yogendra Kumar, His Excellency Barry O'Farrell, Shyam Saran and Zorawar Daulat Singh in conversation with Jyoti Malhotra. A new dynamism pervades the crucial relationship between India and Australia, with China as an important element in the larger equilibrium of the region. India's strategic, political and economic relationship with the countries in the South Asia-Australasia region have far-reaching consequences. The panelists take a long, hard look at crucial factors such as global health, climate change and military balance. Former diplomat Yogendra Kumar's latest book is Geopolitics in the Era of Globalisation, Mapping an Alternative Global Future. His Excellency Barry O'Farrell is the current Australian High Commissioner to India, Foreign Affairs Analyst and writer, historian and Foreign Affairs Analyst. Zorawar Daulat Singh's latest book is Power Shift, India-China Relations in a Multipolar World. Shyam Saran is a former Foreign Secretary of India. His latest book is How India Sees the World. In conversation with editor and journalist Jyoti Malhotra, they evaluate the steps that nations, international institutions, and people-to-people relationships can take. Yogendra Kumar has served in several important capitals in different parts of the world during his diplomatic career. At headquarters, he handled both bilateral and multilateral relations, covering a wide range of subjects. Post-retirement, he's been writing and lecturing in India and abroad on foreign policy and security issues. His Excellency Barry O'Farrell was announced as Australia's High Commissioner to India in February 2020. He served in the Parliament of New South Wales from 1995 to 2015, including as the state's 43rd Premier between 2011 and 2014. As Premier, O'Farrell initiated and led annual trade missions to India to promote economic, cultural and social links between New South Wales and the states of India. Ambassador Shyam Saran is a former Foreign Secretary of India and has served as Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. He's headed the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, a prestigious think tank focusing on economic issues, and was Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board under the National Security Council. He's recently published a book, How India Sees the World. Saran was awarded the Padma Bhushan, the third highest civilian award in 2011 for his contributions to civil service. Zorawar Daulat Singh is a historian and strategist based in New Delhi. He is the founder of the North Cap University, a state private university located in Gurgaon, and is an adjunct fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. His recent books include Power and Diplomacy, India's Foreign Policies During the Cold War, and Power Shift, India-China Relations in a Multipolar World. Jyoti Malhotra is editor, National and Strategic Affairs of the print news portal based in New Delhi. She is the president of the Indian Women's Press Corps and a member of a South Asian network of journalists called South Asian Women in the Media. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, Asia and Australia, Mapping Alternative Realities, Yogendra Kumar, Barry O'Farrell, Shyam Saran and Zorawar Daulat Singh in conversation with Jyoti Malhotra. Jyoti.
Welcome to this wonderful spring morning. We're all in the comfort of our homes, perhaps at our places of work, but there's nothing better than to be at the Jaipur Literature Festival virtually. And of course, we hope that we will be there again next year. So thank you again for inviting me. And it is my great pleasure to introduce, not just to reintroduce all the participants, but to show you their book. So this is Shyam Saran's book. I hope you can see this on your screen. It's How India Sees the World, Kautilya to the 21st Century. And those of you who haven't read it, you're missing out on something, because this is the ultimate primer to India's foreign policy. Then we have Zorawar Daulat Singh, and I'd like to show you his book. It's called Power Shift, India-China Relations in a Multipolar World. And since we're still in the middle of the India-China now disengagement, The withdrawal is still taking place on the heights of Ladakh. But I would suggest that all of you read at least the first chapter, which is a short history to give you a great view of what's happening and why it's happening. And then I have with me Yogendra Kumar's book called The Geopolitics and the Era of Globalization. And we will talk about this, including a Gandhian angle. But let me begin by introducing our topic this morning. It's Asia and Australia mapping alternative realities. And may I ask the Australian High Commissioner, Barry O'Farrell, if you could perhaps launch this discussion and explain to us, now that both Australia and India are very much part of the Quad, along with the US and Japan, but in a sense, Australia has been really at the forefront of this, of some discomfiture with China. The Chinese have been more than reprimanding. They've threatened to sort of downsize the trade basket. How does Australia see it? And also, how do you feel that several other of the Quad partners, including India, haven't said very much about this?
Well, Jody, it's terrific to be part of this discussion, and it comes against the backdrop of a year in which there's been a tectonic shift in relations between India and Australia, caused in part by COVID, ironically, at a time when individuals are being told to isolate and lock down. Our two nations have become closer together, but also clearly at a time of increasing geostrategic tensions within our region. We're seeing a shift of power and influence from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific, at the same time as a rise in uncertainty. And yes, this Australia's economic relationship with one of its trading partners, China, has also taken a hit. It's not for me to comment on the India-China relationship, but I'm happy to talk about Australia's relationship with China, and we remain committed to continuing our trading links with China. We, as a trading nation, assume that people buy products from us because they need those products. Both of our peoples in India and in Australia and China have benefited from the economic ties between our two countries, but it's not surprising that there are differences between us, given our different political and economic systems. And China's outlook and the nature of its external engagement in the region and globally has clearly changed in recent years, and we can't pretend things are the way they were. The world has changed, and we continue to seek to engage with China on the basis of mutual benefit, which is what most trading nations do. And we're committed to trying to find a way for our nations and people to continue to beneficially engage in the future. But has it been tough? It's been tough on the farm sector in Australia. It's been tough on other sectors. But Australia is resilient. We've gone through shifts in trading blocks in the past. And happily, we continue to produce goods that the world seeks. And even more happily, a part of the increased relationship between Australia and India is also now increasingly focused on economic trade and investment matters.
Right. Mr. Shamsaran, you've watched China for several decades now. You're an expert, perhaps one of India's top strategists, strategic analysts and thinkers. Now, how do you see the Quad? Do you see it as a bloc that is seeking to sort of contain China, although I use that word very hesitantly? And how do you see the disengagement in Ladakh as Chinese and Indian troops withdraw? Do you think that there is a message there for the Chinese?
As far as the Quad is concerned, I think it would be perhaps wise to not come up with a definitive, conclusion right away. I would say that it is still evolving. I think the various partners are beginning to sort of be comfortable dealing with one another. But they are also, to some extent, hedging because, the situation in our region, situation globally is undergoing a transformation, as Barry said. So things are not very clear. But I think I would like to point to a trend of steady crystallization of the Quad. Starting with very hesitant beginnings, it has become a forum which is now here to stay. All the four partners, in fact, have said that it is here to stay. We recently had the third ministerial meeting of the Quad. I would have hoped that they came up with a joint statement rather than, separate statements after the meeting. But maybe
why do you think they're still being hesitant? This is the third meeting of the foreign ministers. Shouldn't they sort of at least come forward and commit to some vows with each other?
they should. That's why I said that I would have hoped that they came out with a joint statement, but that will come. The indication that the four partners are even looking at a possible summit meeting of the four partners, that's a very good sign as well. Don't forget, I think the value of the Quad is that the four partners put together, if we are looking at China, these four partners together are more powerful than China is. I mean, that's the reality. So as far as the balance of power is concerned, should the four countries find ways of really coming together even closer than they are, I think, the ability to constrain, if not contain China, you said you would not like to use the word contain, that is, demonstrates the hesitancy all of us have in using that term. But the fact is that the four countries are uniquely positioned to really constrain the kind of aggressive or assertive behavior of China, both in the region and beyond. As far as the India-China disengagement is concerned, I know that there are views that perhaps we have given too much, that perhaps we should not have made the kind of concession that we did on the southern heights of the Pangkong Lake. But as a first step, I think this is a positive step, which should be welcome, because prolonged confrontation, some places eyeball to eyeball confrontation, that sets up the perfect scenario for accidents, for misperception. So to the extent that both sides have decided to step back from that is a good sign. But again, here, this is also an evolving situation.
Right.
Because there are several sectors of the border which we have not really dealt with so far. And the last meeting which was held did not seem to indicate that the two sides were in a position to come to a agreement with respect to some of the other areas. So that we'll have to wait and watch. But yes, I think the Chinese side is perhaps aware that there is a pushback. And by the way, not only a pushback from the Quad, but pushback from other quarters as well. So perhaps that has given China a cause for a little pause in the manner in which they are rolling out their policies.
Sure. Now, Zorawat Daulat Singh, may I ask you to pick up from what these two speakers have said? And in particular, I'd like to ask you two questions. One is that, Mr. Shamsaran just said that the four countries of the Quad are perhaps more powerful, stronger than China. And the second is that in the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, which is going to be celebrated later this year, how does China look at its own power, its own rise as perhaps the as a second most powerful country in the world, at least economically? So, and how do you connect these two issues?
Thank you, Jyoti. Yeah, so I think that one of the things that India and China's neighbors are grappling with is how do you sort of manage the rise of a powerful economic force in Asia that's now already entangled with the global economy and the regional economy. So it's so different from previous episodes of managing power transitions or managing a rising power. It's precisely reflecting in the sort of the gradual approach that the Quad or other plurilaterals are taking, in a sense that all these states also have very deep vested economic interests with China. They have independent geopolitical disputes with China. So for them to come together in sort of a NATO-style Article 5 commitment is extremely difficult. So that's precisely where the challenge is, and China, in a sense, exploits that in a way because it deals with each individually rather than sort of worrying about a collective sort of security system, which it does not want to seek. on how China, I would sort of move towards what explains a little bit of this sort of de-escalation or a lessening of tension on the India-China front. I think there is a sense of change, partly because of the election in the United States. You have a new administration that is reconsidering some of the policies of the way Trump engaged with Asia. I see China, also Chinese policymakers, leaders, somewhat uncertain of where that trend is going. Is the US-China policy going to be different to the way the United States was sort of operating in the last 4 years? And I think Indian policymakers are also a little conscious and uncertain of where the United States is going to go with China. So there's a whole lot of bargaining happening between them. And I think it's a welcome development that India and China have at least lowered the temperature on this long frontier, because avoiding conflict allows us to now relook at Asia from a wider canvas than just get bogged down in South Asia. And that's partly what we're seeing also on India-Pakistan relations as well, where we have sort of, at least, as you said, there's an outbreak of peace. So this allows us to sort of just take a reset and perhaps see where things are going, because there's a whole lot of flux going on in the larger Asian canvas.
Okay. So Yogendra Kumar, I was struck by the fact that in your book, you talk about the Gandhian praxis as an alternative to the view of the world, especially even in terms of sort of geopolitics. But if you look at the India-China evolving story, how would a Gandhian deal with the violent situation in which, 20 Indian troops died last year in the Galwan Valley? How would a Gandhian react to that? I mean, is there really an alternative, or are we just speaking hypothetically?
Well, that's a good point. And of course, it depends upon where you begin. I mean, if you talk about the current paradigm, geopolitical paradigm, in my book, I bring a perspective on that as to how this paradigm has come to be what it is today, which we had to deal with now. And I begin with the end phase of Cold War, when there was the détente, when they were actually thinking of re-scripting a new global order. And we know what actually happened since then. So in the book that I address really is the issue of the current, let's say, methodological conundrum, the confusion as to what kind of future we are going to look at, the uncertainty, the unpredictability of what actually awaits us. So in fact, in my book, I begin by referring to the national...
How would you deal with this? How would a Gandhian...
I'm coming to that. So I'm talking here, when there's uncertainty, there's a question of how we manage political change. So in my book, I do not say that you not push back against China because China actually is being aggressive towards India and to its neighbors. What I'm trying to say is that whole lot of problem that we're facing today, in which we have to deal with China, grapple with China, all at the same time, these problems actually basically relate to, as I said, the problem of managing political change. Take, for example, Burma, Myanmar. Take, for example, Nepal. Take, for example, Sri Lanka, or the neighboring countries around China. You take Central Asia, take Kyrgyzstan, take Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So when you have this uncertainty all around you, you find conflicting interests, and they come into a clash, and certain kind of aggressive behavior appears. So what I'm trying to say in my book really is this, that whilst we are actually having to push back against China, we also have to combine at the level of, let's say, middle power, so to say, because as Mr. Samson said, that we can push them back. We can show the constraints of the behavior. And at the same time, look at a larger issue as to how we're going to manage climate change, population, kind of imbalances, and arms, sort of what we talk about, the lack of equilibrium in terms of balance of power and so on and so forth.
Yeah, now that's interesting. And, you mentioned Myanmar, and Shamsaran is a former Indian ambassador to Myanmar. And what is interesting in the current context, especially with people protesting, defying the curfew of the Tatmadaw or the army. But may I come back to you, High Commissioner O'Farrell, and ask you about how the new Joe Biden administration, now they haven't said very much about China yet, but do you feel that they will have other ideas? There have been several policy reviews. We've seen them go back a lot of what the Trump guys did. But do you think on the China question, there will be continuity rather than change?
Look, I think the United States will determine its China policy on the basis of what's best for its national interest in the same way that India and Australia do. But what's clear is that President Biden's team is committed to the Indo-Pacific. What's clear is their commitment to the Quad is also there. And I think that provides a stability for India as a natural leader of the region, and Australia and Japan and ASEAN to be able to plan with greater certainty as we move forward. Can I just comment, Jyoti, on two issues? One is, there is a remarkable fixation I notice in India since I've arrived about the content of statements post-Quad meetings. The last thing I did before leaving Australia a year ago was to go to an Australian wedding where vows were exchanged, and the groom and the bride's vows were different, but the commitment was the same. The commitment is there, and that's what's clearly important in the Quad, and that's why I think that, as Foreign Secretary Saran has said, it is going to stay, and it is still crystallising.
But the degree of commitment of the bridegroom may differ from the degree of commitment of the bride, right? I mean, I'm sure that's possible too.
Well, the great thing about our relationships is we marry other people. We're engaged with other people. We're not clones of each other. That would be an incredibly boring life. And so, each country has national interests, and I think over this difficult 12 months, through COVID, through geostrategic tensions, India has displayed an incredible, nuanced approach to its region, both through the start of COVID with its neighbours, now through vaccine diplomacy, but more importantly, by engaging through plurilateral arrangements with a variety of nations across our region to try and deliver that safe, secure, open and rules-based region we want.
Right. Can I ask you another question before I move, High Commissioner, which is that you have a trade, you have a bilateral trade agreement with China, I imagine, right? Now you have this sort of increasing discomfort on the trade front. You're also part of RCEP. How do you sort of cohere or synchronize all these sort of conflicting issues?
Well, as I said before, we've been a trading nation for more than 200 years. We've always sought to present our goods to the world, find customers to support our economy, and we've had success. I'm old enough to remember when we sent most of our goods to the UK. When the UK joined the common market, we had to find other markets, and we've been doing that probably every 25 years since. I have no doubt that...
How does it feel to be, on the one hand, to be told by the Chinese, look, we're not going to buy your wine, or we're not going to buy your beef, and then continue to trade with them? I suppose you have to bite your tongue.
Well, ultimately, whether I'm a corner store in Delhi or a country like Australia, you seek customers and you seek to serve the needs of those customers on the basis that you're selling things that they want. But there is no doubt that the relationship has changed. There's no doubt that the region has changed. It is more difficult. Clearly, China's engagement with the world is far more aggressive and more difficult than it has been in the past. It just sets a challenge. And whether we sell goods to China, to India or other countries, we'll do so on the basis that we're selling things that people want.
Right. But I think, Mr. Saran, can I ask you to comment on that? It's interesting that the Australians have continued this very vibrant trading relationship with the Chinese. And I'm just wondering, now that Indian and Chinese troops are disengaging in Ladakh, whether we should take a leaf out of what Australia has been doing and begin to retrade with China. And I think some of that is already happening.
Well, China emerged as the largest trade partner for India during the year that we had the confrontation. So, right. So what's new in a sense? We are trading with China.
So I'm just wondering, can you separate this aggression?
No, you can't. I think neither in the case of Australia can you separate the trade relationship from the political relationship. I mean, the Chinese have ensured that the two cannot be separated. Not Australia, not India in a sense. So it is the Chinese who have made certain that, trade and politics will be used together. And, the trade relationship is used like a political weapon. So I think even though we may want to separate the trading relationship from the rest of the relationship, I'm afraid that is not possible. There will be points where the two will intersect. That is one point. Secondly, as far as the what Barry said about the Quad, that maybe we need to have different vows. Doesn't really matter very much. I would hope that from polygamy we move to monogamy sometime, because I think just sort of hanging in between may not really impress the Chinese very much, may not impress potential partners very much. It is good that the Quad is also reaching out to ASEAN countries. It is also inviting, for example, some of the major European countries also to articulate their own Indo-Pacific strategy. So these are good signs, and I do hope that this crystallization process that I spoke about, this continues in the future. What I would also like to focus attention on is that in terms of India-Australia relationship, I think what is striking is that we have really come a very long way. Where there has been, in a sense of, there has been a kind of a mutual indifference in the past. Also a sense of, since we both speak English and we, both of us play cricket, what else is there to know about each other? There is a great deal to know about each other, as we are discovering. So I think there is a need for further investment by the two countries in learning about each other, because that is what will really bring the two countries. Don't forget, Australia and India are really two bookends. If you look at the ocean space,
Two bookends of the Indo-Pacific, yes.
Exactly. So they have a very critical role to play. And irrespective of what the level of commitment of the United States may be to the region, I think India and Australia need to work together. And lastly, I would like to point out that yes, the new administration in Washington has committed itself to the Indo-Pacific strategy, has committed itself to the Quad. But if you look at, for example, President Biden's speech at the Munich Security Conference recently, the focus is Europe. The focus is on giving primacy to alliance relationships within NATO. Talking about, a concept of democracies with respect to almost a revival of the G7. So yes, Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific will continue to be very important for the Biden administration. But to me, it seems that Biden places great priority on the relationship with Europe. And as far as the relationship with China is concerned, I think what the Munich speech shows is he talks about Russia being a security threat, but he talks about China being an economic threat. That will be the competition. So it would appear that in the scheme that Biden administration is sort of sketching, the relationship with China is seen more as a competitive relationship. Relatively speaking, I'm saying it does not mean that the security element is not there, but perhaps the focus there is on how to make certain that the United States of America is able to win the economic competition, the technological competition with China.
Right. So, Robert, may I ask you to comment on, on this? In your book, you write about how the Chinese would like for there to be no separation of powers, if you like, between the business or the economic side of the relationship. But when we saw over the last year in Ladakh, the Indians did separate that. Now it seems to be business as usual. So is it that India has learned to bite its tongue because it doesn't have the options are limited? What does India do in a situation like this?
So, Jyoti, in fact, when you look back, even at the modus vivendi that was crafted in, let's say, the end of the Cold War, 1988, it was never envisaged a separation where you could sort of separate the dispute and the rest of the relationship. It was always envisaged that you have a dispute, you're going to try and keep working towards the resolution, but you're not going to let that process of peaceful resolution hold back an incremental accumulation of interdependence and ties on other fronts. So it's been this parallel process for the last 30 years that kind of hit a dead end in a sense in the last recent years as the border dispute began to sort of come alive again and began to manifest not just in terms of verbal or political disagreements, but frankly, military sort of friction and last year, as we saw, outbreak of even violence. So in that sense, of course, the Indian position, and I don't think even China disputes that you cannot have a normal relationship if you do not have basic peace on the frontier. I think now what's happening is that the Chinese are trying to sort of restore or link the final resolution of this crisis. And because there are still several points that remain to be settled on India assuring its China that there's going to be a normal relationship once that happens. So there is a bit of a mismatch here in the sequence of events. But I think both sides, if you look at even Wang Yi's comments yesterday, I think they both recognize that you cannot have any normal relationship until you have sort of stabilized your geopolitical disagreements.
Okay.
On this point, Jyoti, of coming back to even this broad Indo-Pacific, I think we sort of are positing our arguments on these assumptions that were crafted during the First Cold War, in a sense, where you had an Iron Curtain, maybe not as hard as it was in Europe, but you certainly had these US alliances in the Pacific in the First Cold War, and China was sort of left out. But by the 1970s, that sort of framework fell away, right? I mean, the biggest beneficiary of globalization has been China's rise and China's engagement with the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea. And today, you're talking of trillions of dollars of trade and collectively amongst those groups of countries, over $1 trillion of FDI both ways. Collectively. So, I mean, this idea that you're going to now contain or roll back Chinese power is frankly a non-starter in those major capitals. So I think what India should be looking at is how do you craft a policy towards China where interdependence is a reality today? And then you go out and seek security. So I think we have sort of been catching up on frankly, a framework that I think the US, look at Japan, for example, look at Europe. I mean, none of the European leaders bought into Biden's speech at the Munich Security Conference. The French president did not even refer to China in his speech. So you're seeing a more complicated world order, which is a multipolar world order. And where are you going to, that is India going to fit into this, is perhaps the biggest challenge for us.
Yeah. So we've opened up the session to audience questions, and I have a first question from Harbhajan, who's asking, how does the neo-nationalism of the US and the neo-colonization of China affect India? Yogendra, may I ask you to take this, please? And also if you could bring in, perhaps, you've served in Central Asia as ambassador. Can you bring in what the Russian role and how Russia looks at the Indo-Pacific? We know that it has a different understanding of the Indo-Pacific that the rest of the Quad does. So if you can answer this question and bring that in as well.
Well, as far as the neo-nationalism or neo-colonialism is concerned, I think the reality is, of course, quite mixed nowadays because of the fact that you have this rise of nationalism in most countries, and certainly in China, they're trying to capitalize on that. But the Chinese approach basically has been that you try to develop a relationship with dependency and then to use that for application of either first economic pressure, but also geostrategic pressure. The same kind of thing they were trying to do as far as the LSE kind of confrontation is concerned, because they were testing India's ability to push back so that they would shape or influence our foreign policy. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, now Russia actually looks at Central Asia as in one way an area of strategic importance. And they're actually very conscious and very, very suspicious of what the Chinese actually are doing there. So there is at the moment a kind of division of functions that Russia overrides the security of Central Asian countries, and the economic development takes place within that security umbrella. But that actually is a very, unviable kind of an arrangement, because ultimately where you have an economic relationship, that is where the security comes in. And you find that thing fraying at the end now. So Russia actually is in a real dilemma at the moment, more so because the fact that as you see the instability in Central Asia, and Kyrgyzstan, for example, the election that took place of the prime minister, now the president, the general reporting actually is that his election is funded by the Chinese.
Right.
And of course, the debt dependency of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and to certain extent Kazakhstan. actually is with China, and therefore this kind of thing makes the situation quite unviable. And that's really where you find, as far as Russia in Indo-Pacific is concerned,
Yeah.
I think the Russians are very suspicious of the Quad, very clearly because of the kind of relationship we developed between them and China. On the Indo-Pacific itself, I think they can be somewhat amenable because the fact, I'm quite sure that Russians also would not want that there would be an imbalance of equilibrium against them in favor of China, either in South China Sea or the East China Sea, because
Right.
these are areas of them, their area of strategic importance, and also the Arctic Sea, because that's where the openly hostile the Chinese coming there. So
Right.
there's kind of scope for our diplomacy and our diplomacy to play.
Thanks, Yogendra. There is another question by Anuradha Rai Chaudhary, who's talking about India's look east and act east policy, and she says that Sushma Swaraj, the former external affairs minister, used to talk a lot about look east and act east. So the question to you, Mr. Shamsaran, what do you hope? I mean, and this is Anuradha's question. What has the look east and act east policy accomplished? It's been on now for the last 15 or 20 years. And if I could ask you specifically to look at Sri Lanka and as part of your answer, please.
The Act East policy has been a great success until recently, I would say, because if you look at the trajectory
when does recently begin?
Well, recently is as far back as 1992, when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao spoke about a look east policy, reorienting India's foreign policy to its eastern flank. And I think it was very timely that he did that. And since then, if you look at the trajectory of the relationship, it has grown from a sectoral dialogue partner to a full dialogue partner to recently to a strategic partnership between ASEAN countries and India. So, we have politically, if you look at it, we have traversed a fairly ambitious ground. And even in terms of trade and investment, even though perhaps the expectations were not borne out, in terms of the level of trade and investment, there is no doubt that India today is plugged in far more than ever before into this very dynamic economic relationship, which, by the way, also includes.
Can I ask you, Mr. Saran, can I add to Anuradha's question and ask you, there is, people are protesting in Myanmar. Now, India is a very close relationship with Myanmar. We also share a long boundary. How do you think India should look at the people's protest? If we are a democracy, and Yogendra Yadav talks about a Gandhian praxis, how do you look at what's going on there?
If you look at how India has handled these kind of events in the past, there is always a tension between our desire as a democracy to see that democracy flourishes in more and more countries, and particularly in our neighborhood. That was the case if you take our policy with respect to Nepal, for example. With respect to Myanmar, I would say, and that's partly my experience as ambassador in Myanmar, that we had to make a very careful balancing between what were very important, security interests we had, and our preference for a more democratic political dispensation in Myanmar. And I have no hesitation in saying that at a certain point of time, the security aspect was perhaps more salient than the democracy aspect. And with regard to the current situation in Myanmar, I would say the situation has not changed very much. The good news is that we have maintained fairly good relationship with the Myanmar military, even as we have tried to assist in the democratization process in Myanmar, maintained very close relations with the National League of Democracy. So in a sense, should you choose to play a role, you are actually in very well positioned to do so, because you do have very good relationship with both sides of the equation. Whether we will or not, I am not very sure, but you would have noticed that we have not called the a military takeover a coup so far. We have said recent developments in Myanmar. We have not used that word.
Right.
So maybe there is a certain wiggle room that we have. And I think you will see that this is very much also the approach of most of the Southeast Asian countries. So hopefully, going forward, this will be something which does not, in a way, adversely impact our Act East policy. Lastly, I would just like to point out that while I spoke about a very deepening of the relationship with ASEAN, recently, there has been, to my mind, a setback because we decided not to go ahead with the RCEP. That economic pillar of the relationship has weakened somewhat, and we will have to find other ways of continuing to give momentum to the Act East policy.
Right. So there's one more question. We're almost out of time, but I do have time for one more question. Parush is asking that Parush is saying that China's continuous intrusion is quite worrying, and he's talking about the intrusion across the line of action control. And Zorawar, this question is to you. Do you think that our neighboring countries, meaning India's neighbors, are helping China being part of its ring fence? He puts that within quotes, but I think he's wondering whether these intrusions that China has across the LAC into India and how China's relationship with its neighbors pan out, especially when India believes that its neighborhood is its own sphere of influence.
Mm-hmm. I don't think any of the other neighbors, the smaller neighbors, are particularly interested in a conflict between India and China, and neither are they enabling it in a sense. And they actually fear a heightening of tension between India and China. It reduces their room for maneuverability and play this so-called non-alignment, the way we used to play in years back. So they would like stability and sort of work or play off Delhi and Beijing when it suits them. But I don't think they have any role to play in this is China and India pursuing their security interests in the absence of an unresolved dispute for 70 years. So I think until we sort of find some sort of a settlement on that, and short of that, restore some of those very thoughtful confidence building measures that were placed in the 1990s and 2000s. So I think there's a huge task left for both leaderships to restore a sense of stability back on the frontiers. And I don't foresee being completely pessimistic. I think there's scope for room to sort of work towards this if there's that political will on both sides.
Okay. High Commissioner O'Farrell, you have a couple of questions addressed to you. The first is by Aparajita. She's asking about the Australia-China relationship and specifically in terms of China's military rise. And now also with the onset of the pandemic, how does Australia look at that?
Well, Australia makes no bones about its concerns about some of the strategic pressures, for instance, in the South China Sea, and we continue to do two things, which is exercise our rights of navigation, but secondly, continue to call for these issues to be resolved according to international law, in that case through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Part of the closeness between Australia and India is a shared vision for the Indo-Pacific, a vision that seeks to deliver security, openness, sovereignty based on the rule of law to nations across the region, because that's ultimately what both our Prime Ministers said mid-year is our shared sacred duty. And so we've never traded our views in relation to strategic issues for any trade advantage.
Right. Now, Dhimant has a related question, and he's talking about China building ports, outside, sort of elsewhere in Asia and also in Africa. But I have, and I'd like to also, if you could conclude with picking up on what Ambassador Shamsaran said, where he talked about the RCEP and how India's refusal to join the RCEP, Australia, of course, is a key member of the RCEP, has led to some sort of differences between India and this part of the world, including Australia, and how you look at that.
Well, we respect India's decision because, as I've said a couple of times, governments, countries will make decisions according to their national interest. We made no bones in the lead up to RCEP that we'd like India to sign up. They continue to be able to attend meetings and access meetings, but that's a decision that India will take. I don't think it has set back India's reputation with the rest of the Indo-Pacific, because as I go about my work here, advancing Australia's trade, economic and investment interests in India, I see many of my ASEAN colleagues and others from across the region doing precisely the same thing. So India's attractiveness, India's growth, India's potential to be an even bigger global manufacturing centre will override any concerns about whether it signs up to an agreement or not.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our session this morning. Thank you all, gentlemen. Australian High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell, Zorawat Daulat Singh, Yogendra Kumar, and former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran. Thank you so much for this wonderful interaction. And back to you, Sanjoy.
Thank you, Yogendra Kumar. Thank you, Barry, Shyam Saran, Zorawat Daulat Singh, and Jyoti Malhotra. What an insightful session, especially keeping in mind the ongoing geopolitics issues with China, Australia, and of course, India. We'd like to thank the Business Standard for supporting the session and our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you for all watching and being such a great audience. Remember to stay logged on. You can go on and watch episodes at the Darbar Hall as well. Remember to visit Amazon online and book your books. And of course, Earth Fables, our wonderful artisans platform. Do remember, if you can, to support us at Teamwork Arts to continue to bring you news and information and knowledge from across the world. Till then, stay safe and stay masked. Tweet using the hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and at Jaipur Literature Festival. The festival is protected by Dettol.